Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to the Post 91, Competence and Incompetence. This post comes via request from two remarkable people that we'll talk about in 1 second, but I've received hundreds of queries in the last few months, basically asking me a singular question. What's going on, Tara? And I will try to address that fantastically important question in the next few weeks and indeed the next few months. And you'll find post our very long job series that we're going to move around topics a great deal. The requests are coming in, keep them coming in, and I'll try and answer them the best I can. But I received a request independently from two different people, Adam and Trish. And both of them had listened to my book, Know What You Do Not Know. And they approached me and they were fantastic. And they said, well, look, how do we know? How do we know what we do not know? And Adam was relatively robust in his email and asked me, well, if someone is incompetent, and used the word incompetent and in my workplace, how will they ever find out that they're incompetent without me saying they're incompetent? And I've been basically saying they're incompetent, and it is making no difference to their lives and their attitudes. And of course, therefore, use the word incompetent. And I thought, you know what, maybe this is the moment that we go back to a very interesting article that was published in 1999. And it's a very rare and special piece of research because it's moved through popular culture. You know, most refereed articles are refereed articles and other scholars read them and cite them, but they don't move into popular culture. Occasionally, remarkable pieces of research do. A little bit's cut off them or sliced out of them and they move. And so the research I'm talking about this week is from Justin Kruger and David Dunning. Now, those names may be resonating already for you. In popular culture, this remarkable article from 1999 has been reified into the Dunning-Kruger effect. And what's happened is a few of their unbelievably remarkable interpretations of their data set have circulated in the culture, and all sorts of people use them in all different circumstances, and was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And up to today, up to 5 minutes ago, it has been cited 11,053 times since 1999. So that's remarkable. But let me tell you something odd about those citations. It's been cited 5,140 times since 2020. So for an article that is 26 years old, it is astonishing that the citations in many ways are kicking up. They are continuing at quite a rate. And there are reasons for that. The early citations, when I've done the analysis of it for you, the early citations were very much from psychology. So psychologists were citing other psychologists, right? Cool. But what's happened in the last 26 years is that all sorts of other disciplines have cited this work. We've seen it obviously in leadership studies, but also in followership studies. We've seen it in higher education studies and some very interesting micro disciplines that are emerging in the last 10 years or so, ignorance studies and of course failure studies. And can I say there was this very odd and interesting spike in usage, in citation in 2020, 2021 and 2022 to try and understand why university students were not listening to, were not watching the lectures that were prepared for them during the pandemic. So academics worked incredibly hard to make sure that they had a multimodal experience and they would gain their content. And yet, as the research has shown, all this great and rich material was prepared and students didn't watch it. Why? And so the Dunning-Kruger effect was used to understand what was going on. So as you can see, this research, even though it's of a past time, it's very active and engaged and interesting in our present. So Kruger and Dunning started, as many research projects do, with a really casual observation in their daily life. Why do people hold favourable views of their abilities and express great confidence in those abilities socially and culturally? So what happens when any of us overestimate our abilities? And so what happens is we have great confidence in our ability, that of course is not an ability, and because we've got confidence in our lack of ability, we make errors. We make mistakes in our daily life. And what happens is, because we overestimate how good we are, we move through life and we reach bad or mistaken conclusions from our interpretations of the world through our personal lens. So in other words, the incompetent do not know that they are incompetent. They think they're competent and they make seriously bonkers decisions in their daily life. So Kruger and Dunning realised that none of us are 100% competent or incompetent. So you're not just incompetent. All of us in different domains of life are either competent or incompetent. And if you want to talk about domains of life, another way to describe it is in the discourses in our lives, our textual systems, right? And that competence and incompetence is very much bespoke and customised in those domains of life. So let's try and put this into my language, in my discourse. So our literacy is determined in a social semiotic. We have particular encoding and decoding skills in particular areas of our lives, right? So we're able to read and interpret what is going on and then share that meaning with others. So semiotics at its most basic is the capacity to read, interpret and write in our context. So we're encoding and decoding so that other people share our meaning system. But social semiotics is a little bit more complex because it argues that this encoding and decoding process happens in a context, and those contexts change. So let me give you an example of this. I read a lot of academic books in very specific disciplines. So I have literacy to encode and decode that material in those disciplines. So in those very specific disciplines, I am literate and I am competent. But place me in front of a tyre with a puncture and I am absolutely and completely incompetent. I have absolutely no idea what to do, much to my shame. And this was caused by primary socialisation. I have a wonderful father, and my father was quite old when I was born, and he had still has pretty strong ideas about what is men's work and what is women's work. And changing a tyre is not women's work. Thank you, Big Kev. But that's not about Big Kev, because in the subsequent decades, I have sustained that socialisation, because through my adult life, I'm now impossibly old and close to death. And in my adult life, I have also never learned how to change a tyre that has a puncture. So I'm just now sharing with us all my complete incompetence in tyre changing, and I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to, from today, look, I'm embarrassed. I'm going to look at YouTube videos. I'm going to look at how we do that, and then I'm going to involve an expert. This is going to become important in a sec. I'm going to involve an expert, my husband, Professor Jamie Quinton, and he is going to verify my methodology and strategies and behaviour on the weekend in changing a tyre. This incompetence will now stop. But you can see that's how competence and incompetence operates. It refers to behaviours and attitudes in particular domains of life. Cool. Now Kruger and Dunning enacted 4 studies in 3 domains. So the 3 domains were humour, They were grammar and logic. Now, very different domains. I wouldn't have done that, but still very different domains because the capacity to triangulate between the domains relatively difficult. But they separated, here we go, they separated their results from the tests in those three domains into quartiles, right? So 4 quarters, top 25%, bottom 25%, you get the deal. And hang on to yourself, let's do it. They discovered that the bottom 25%, quote, grossly overestimated their test performance and ability, end of quote. Grossly overestimated. So this was a radical miscalibration, and it was of such a scale that there was a profound inability to distinguish between accuracy and error. Okay, so therefore a meta question is going to float through our work this week. How do we recognize the limitations in our work and behavior? How do we know what we don't know? So this is fascinating research so far. And then they activated and applied Miller's argument. Now Miller, and you'll see it in my reference list at the end, Miller's research from 1993 was incredibly interesting. Quote, "It is one of the essential features of incompetence that the person so inflicted is incapable of knowing that he is incompetent. To have such knowledge would already remedy a good portion of the offence." End of quote. Wow. Okay. So therefore, knowing what we do not know is the first step in moving from incompetence to competence. So let me give you the famous example that everybody uses. There are thousands of references to this online, and they're all incredibly funny. So here is an example of an incompetent person not knowing about their incompetence. So in 1995, MacArthur Wheeler walked into 2 Pittsburgh banks and robbed them. And he robbed them during the day. So his face could clearly be seen, no disguise, nothing at all, thanks for playing. So after the footage was shown in the news of him doing the bank robberies, he was arrested within the hour. Okay, but the trouble is, when he was arrested, he kept saying to the arresting officers, to the police, "But I wore the juice. But I wore the juice." And the police, upon asking him further questions about wearing the juice, then found out that he was under the impression that if he puts lemon juice on his face, then a camera will not be able to record his face. So as you can see, this incompetence was perpetuated because there was no intervening information or data set that made him change his mind. So we're all used to the argument, particularly those of us that are involved in teaching and learning and education, that success is based on verifiable information and knowledge. So success emerges from recognizing particular actions and behaviors, and they are then tested. They are then assessed. You don't just go, "Oh, look, I'm good, I can read a bit, thanks for playing." You're actually assessed. Stuff from outside comes in to evaluate you. So it means we read a lot, we take good notes, we learn how to write, and our research improves. But we don't take our own word for that. Endlessly, our work is evaluated, assessed, referees, and if we make a mistake, we know because we're called on it time and time again. So if you write 10 articles a year like I do, about 30 referees are assessing your work every single year. Okay, so if you're continuing to do professional development, you are being assessed. Okay, so this assumption about gathering verifiable information to confirm that we know what we're doing or not, Also applies in other areas of our lives. So for example, driving. No one takes our word for it. It's like, I can drive, I'm good. No, you have to actually be assessed by an expert to see if you can drive. But also hopefully leadership, but also reading, writing. A lot of formal education requires that verification. Budgeting, you might go, I'm budgeting real good, I'm doing good. The bank will tell you something different if you don't pay that credit card. Okay, so think about these two questions in your own life. What do we do with the ideas that are wrong or in error or useless or dysfunctional? What do we do with those ideas? But also, secondly, the crucial question, how do we work out that we're wrong? Now, in Kruger and Dunning's research, they argued that when people are incompetent, it presents two major problems in their daily life. So let's do them. The first problem is that they reach wrong conclusions and make bad decisions. Think about the lemon juice, yeah? But then there is a second problem that's even more serious. Their incompetence results in these individuals being unable to recognize the errors. Ooh. So, put in my sort of language, a person is not literate in a semiotic system, so they're going to make judgments and interpretations, encoding and decoding. It's not going to work together because they're not literate. And because they're not literate, they can't recognize their errors. So therefore, we have people circulating in our culture who are making errors. Now that's fine. All of us make errors. I stuff up frequently on a daily basis. All of us make errors. But the problem is there's a particular group in the culture that makes the errors and then does not have the literacy to self-correct. Because here it comes, they think they're doing fine. They think everything's good. They're competent. Now, a lot of thinkers, great scientists, great scholars, great politicians through culture, through life, have realised the consequences of this problem. Darwin, most famously in 1871, stated, quote, "Ignorance most frequently begets confidence than does knowledge." End of quote. And Thomas Gray, of course, used the line, that's the great cliche, ignorance is bliss. But also Thomas Jefferson, he who knows best knows how little he knows. End of quote. And it's the Jefferson arc of argument that we're going to finish off with this vlog this week. Kruger and Dunning showed that the same skills that give you confidence and competence in a particular domain are the same skills used to evaluate the competence in that particular domain. That was a brilliant realization, that. It's brilliant because it means we cannot assess our literacy in a textual system unless we are literate in that textual system. If we lack literacy, we can't assess our literacy level. Wow. Okay. So incompetent individuals lack 4 specific skills. Let's do them. Metacognition, meta-memory, comprehension, and self-monitoring skills. The last one is very interesting. So these 4 skills are required on a daily basis to continually configure how well we are as a human being, how well we are performing. It allows us to assess if our methodologies are accurate in assessing, evaluating and solving a particular problem. And it asks, do we actually have the literacies, the knowledges to address and manage this problem? Think about me with my tyre. I know I'm incompetent. I don't know where to start to change a tyre, right? But you've got to assess, do you know what's going on? Yes or no? Now, grammar is probably the best example of the maxims that we're talking about. So the same skills that are used to locate a grammatical error is the skill that allowed you to make the error in the first place. See the problem? If you don't understand grammar, then you're putting errors in your prose, and then you're not going to be able to pick up those errors because that's why they existed in the first place. Okay? The capacity to be correct is the skill set we require to evaluate if we are correct or incorrect. But therefore, the people who make errors in a particular domain are then unable to recognize these errors because of the inaccuracies in assessing their abilities. Right. Put another way, whenever there is a survey about something, so 100 people were surveyed, people, when they're asked, how did you go in that survey? Invariably, the entire population confirms that they're above average. How'd you go? Oh, above average, yeah. The whole population thinks they're above average. Now, of course, mathematically, that's not possible. But it does demonstrate the inability to recognize failure and speak the words about poor performance. So expertise matters a lot in this conversation because novices have lower metacognitive skills than masters, right? So this means we sometimes see in PhD students, only a few of them, but we sometimes see in PhD students, they come to the candidature, they come to the supervisor with incredible confidence. They know what they're doing and they know exactly the information they're going to require to conduct this research project. But of course, they lack the metacognitive skills about what they do not know. Now, I've had a couple of students like this out of the hundreds that I've supervised, and can I say they're almost impossible to supervise, right? Let me tell you what happens. They're so confident because they don't know what they don't know, and they construct sort of this fairy tale of success in their lives and in their research. And I start very gently by just locating the problems, like that's a jump of logic there, that methodology is not sound, you've got a data point of 1 there, you're spending 3,000 words talking about yourself, how is that a generalizable data set? So I start very gently and just try and create that accurate mirror to show what they don't know. And I often fail, and in the case of these two students, I certainly failed. And what happens then? So you can't do any intervention to help them to know what they don't know. So 2 things result in graduate education when that occurs. The first is the student completely disconnects with confidence and uses phrases like, I know how to do a PhD, I don't need you, and so they then ghost you or leave the situation. Now, of course, they don't know how to do a PhD. It's their first enrolment. They've never done a large research project, but they supposedly know how to do a PhD more than their supervisor does. Okay, that's the first one. The second one is that the student continues with this hyper confidence even after I or other supervisors in some detail show what is going wrong in the project. So this means the advice from the expert is ignored. Okay, so these behaviours in doctoral education, can I say, are incredibly rare. But occasionally there will be a hyper-confident student that has really nothing there to back up or verify that confidence, and they don't do well. What often happens, just give you the narrative of what happens here, is that the supervisor begs them to take their advice, and there's all sorts of emails where they're offering them advice and they ignore it, and so then the thesis is submitted to examination. Often they independently go, I'm submitting this even though my supervisor disagrees, and then the examiner reports come back showing exactly what the supervisor specified was wrong with the thesis, and it gets a 4, a 5 or a 6. Okay, now those students of course are part of a wider context about academics and expertise. Of course, we just have to think about Brexit, we've got to think about Andrew Tate, we think about what's going on with the Trump administration. Okay, there's all sorts of contexts where experts are a problem. We don't want experts here. So competent people who are competent, do not attack academics or universities, because they don't have to. They can read the books, read the articles, learn from academics and improve their competence. But there is a really good reason to delete experts, well-qualified academics, because if you are incompetent, if you get rid of the academics, you never have an intervention in your life where someone reveals the incompetence. Because remember, someone makes a statement, an incompetent person makes a statement, there'll be an academic out there that spent 30 years studying that precise topic. So you will appear an absolute moron. So universities are very dangerous places for the incompetent, and academics are very dangerous people for the incompetent, because we're a relatively accurate mirror. So what's happening now is the failure of people who have performed badly to recognise that they've performed badly creates what Dunning and Kruger have argued leaves the incompetent to believe they have performed well. So for me, that's the sort of horrific bit of their research, is they're not touched. The incompetent are not touched by any countervailing data sets. So as an incompetent person, they believe they have performed well. Okay. So if a person cannot make a self-assessment and won't listen to or log comments made by experts who are trying to help them, then it results in incompetent people walking around the world not knowing that they're incompetent. And by the way, this is also an argument I'm using in a book that's just about to be released on academic failure, right? So failure studies is very interesting here. And I've tried to develop a concept called failure literacy. And what I've tried to do is configure a methodology to recognize a failure when it happens, so that failure becomes a diagnostic in life. So instead of failure literacy being developed, these inflated self-assessments never lead to consciousness of incompetence. So remember that all of us, every single human being, all of us are competent and incompetent in different domains. So it's not like there is this competent person and all these incompetent people. No, we're all competent and incompetent. We all have different literacies, right? So therefore, what we're discussing this week is not simply incompetence, because if we know we are incompetent, if we go, yep, I'm a moron, yeah, I can't do that, that's great, because once you recognize your incompetence, you can do something about it. Okay. So if we are incompetent and we know it, we can do something about it. But if we're incompetent and we think we're competent, we think we're amazing, then that miscalibration has consequences for the individual, but also for the wider culture. Significantly, the researchers confirmed that gender doesn't have a variable in this. So gender's not important if you're a bloke, if you're a chick, doesn't matter. If you're incompetent, you're incompetent. So gender, they argued, is not a variable. Some subsequent studies showed it is, but even at the time, trans, non-binary data sets were not available. So they confirmed that gender was not a concern here. But their research, while it discounted gender, did reveal a few final kickers, incredibly important outcomes. The very low performers, so the people in the bottom 25% of results, were completely unaware of their incompetence. But what they showed, and this will absolutely blow your mind, is that the bottom 75% of results, so the bottom 3 quartiles, all overestimated their competence. 75% of the results overestimated their competence, and they didn't have the ability to assess their inability. Okay, now that's amazing enough. You ready for the final kicker? Here we go. The top quartile underestimated their perceived ability via a test score. Yes, you heard that correctly. I'll say it again. The top quartile underestimated their perceived ability. All three other quartiles did not. They confirmed their ability was higher than the test score. So the top quartile underestimated its ability. The three bottom quartiles overestimated their ability. Now, Kruger and Dunning asked why this occurred. This was a remarkable bit of data, and their interpretation, it's had a lot of critiques, but their interpretation at the time was fascinating. They argued that the top quartile did not underestimate themselves, but overestimated the performance of others. Now, there was research from the 1970s from Ross et al. I think it was published in 1977, a remarkable piece of work, and they called this the false consensus effect, end of quote. So most of us sort of think we're sort of part of a group and we're all more alike than unalike, right? But for me, what happens next is really the crucial bit of this study. So we've got the top crew that are underestimating how good they are. The rest of the population, 75%, overestimating how good they are. So that's pretty horrific, but let's go to the next stage. Because what happens is the fourth study was they took the bottom quartile and the top quartile and they let them see the test results of the other group. Okay, so the top 25% got to see the tests of the bottom 25%. This was in grammar. And the bottom 25% got to see the grammar tests of the top 25%. Unbelievable. So what happened? Okay, so we're seeing the results of someone who is very, very different from us. So what happens now? So here we go. When the less competent saw the more competent tests, they could not gauge the competence of others and continued to maintain their confidence that they knew what was going on, they were tremendous. The bottom 25% did not change their view of themselves. No recalibration, no failure literacy. But the top quartile of participants, here we go, raised the ranking of their own score after they saw the poorer papers. So competence creates the ability to recalibrate. So you see what's happened here. With new information, the top quartile were able to reassess their ability. Crucial. So for me, this is really the crucial part of this study. Quote, incompetent individuals failed to gain insights into their own incompetence by observing the behaviour of other people. End of quote. Now think about how in our life we have all these methodologies where we assume that if people share stuff, they'll improve. Think about group work in undergraduate education. Think about all the strategies for peer support and mentoring and networking. All of that's based on people being together and being able to improve by simply being with a more competent person. See the problems. The incompetent do not recognise their incompetence even after seeing other people's work who have achieved so much more than they have. So therefore, Kruger and Dunning offered the maxim, quote, competence begets calibration, end of quote. Competence begets calibration. Brilliant. So from my disciplines, we'd say that competence creates information literacy, or competence creates failure literacy. Now, really, if you deeply take on board what this study has done, it explains why the world is in the mess that it is at the moment, and I'm only slightly joking. 75% of the population is incompetent in a particular field or domain, and they don't know that they are. And even when the top 25% reveals their incompetence, they don't have the failure literacy to recognise it. And look, it explains a lot about what's going on in the world, what's going on in education at the moment, and it really does, I think, reinforce the danger of living in a post-expertise world where university education is dismissed as, quote, woke. Wow. But there is some hope in this article, and I think it's the hope that is the power and the potential for me. And what do they show? And this was the fourth study. What they show is training and professional development, a direct intervention in the domain under discussion, increases competence. Now, firstly, what's significant is the already competent improve their competence through professional development and training. That's great, that's important. But training and professional development also enhances the self-awareness of the incompetent. Why? Because professional development and education in that domain increase the competence in that domain and therefore the capacity to reflect on that competence. Brilliant. So therefore, making the incompetent more competent through an intervention via teaching and learning and professional development made all the difference. Now, this study, remember, 26 years ago, has had enormous critique. The selection of research subjects was limited, like psychology was at the time, using undergraduate students from psychology over and over again. So the selection of subjects has reached some critique. Also, the domain of competence that was assessed was an unusual selection and made triangulation, I would argue, difficult. And also, the foundational work. It was a short article. They did an amazing amount of work, but greater attention was required on what is competence and what is incompetence. There have also been some key unanswered questions that remain. And they are, could metacognition in one domain enhance our understanding of competence in another? Let me explain what that means. So if someone is a great horse rider, they are competent, they've got metacognition, they're in that area, so they're a great horse rider. But say they're a rubbish cook, so they can't cook. Does the competence in one domain have any relationship to incompetence in another? Right. Now, can I say information literacy, media literacy, multimodality theories suggest the answer is yes to that one, but it's an area of great discussion, I think. Now, through the subsequent decades after this article was published, all sorts of new interventions occurred. So gender was evaluated and a series of results emerged there. Also, incompetence and leadership started to be a big area, and no surprise here, incompetence in politics. And can I say one of the most surprising uses of the article in the last couple of years has been from Giray. And can I say, I've been quite disturbed by this. As I've been at the gym every morning, I've been thinking deeply about this research. But Giray has argued that there is a negative impact of generative AI on researchers in terms of, get ready for it, skill erosion. Okay, so there's some very strong work to be done in this field, I think. We gain competence in a particular field, but can we lose that competence? You could base a career studying that. Amazing. And there are great questions left to explore beyond the cliches of the Dunning-Kruger effect. This study does provide answers to, I think, why people who are so wrong are so confident. And even when they are corrected, they ignore the corrections. So consider all the influences. I'll use that dreadful word, influences around us, okay? And it's amazing when you see the PhD influences. I just sort of sit and watch. I don't really offer any comment, but I know a lot of these people because they were in the institutions where I worked for different periods of time. And so what we've got are people who were pretty poor PhD students, enrolled for a long time, produced a pretty poor thesis, got through just about, and then after the thesis is through, they've sort of rebirthed themselves as experts in the PhD influences, okay? And they're telling other people how to do a PhD. Okay, so remember, a data point of one is not research, and particularly when that data point of one was not terribly successful. Okay, but you see, that's the point. All of this is about the capacity to recalibrate, to recognize our ignorance, recognize our incompetence, recognize failure, recognize our illiteracy. And when we do that, suddenly we're not in the 75% of people that are unable to recognise their own incompetence. And the only way to change the views of that 75% is not to confront them with experts, to not confront them with the actual results and data that shows that they're wrong. All that's been demonstrated won't make any difference at all. They don't recognise the competence of others, and that has no impact on their reading of incompetence. But the capacity to intervene, to educate, to give them teaching and learning and professional development, that in that domain, that makes a difference. Okay, increasingly, we're finding that the competence of the incompetent can transform their capacity to recalibrate. That's what we're trying to do. That's what professional development does. Can't change everything, but it can alter the capacity to recalibrate. Now, we can all complain, for example, about the Donald Trump presidency, very easy to do. We can complain deeply about the people who voted for him, and we can abuse them. That's not solving anything. That's not engaging with any issue at all. Understanding the sociology that Trump voters, if they have one correlative characteristic, it is they did not attend 4 years of college. Okay, that's important. Doesn't mean what they think now is what they will always think. Recalibration is always possible. But we need to remember Maggie Haberman's title. Great book this, published in 2022. Confidence Man, the definitive biography of Donald Trump. But this quote's an interesting one. Quote, without understanding how the federal government worked and with little interest in learning, he recreated around him the world that had shaped him. End of quote. And that's it. That's the Donald Trump story. So without a learning infrastructure, we all continue to sort of move through the world thinking that we're masters of our destiny and that we know what's going on. Now, of course, mostly we've got no idea. But in this tough era for educators, for academics, for teachers, for researchers, and indeed a tough era for learning, there is value, I think, in returning once more to this quirky, innovative article published 26 years ago. And it will give us, I think, a warning for our era. And our era is in trouble because it's putting professors on watch lists and it's affirming freedom of speech for everybody while silencing the experts. That's a pretty odd and dangerous combination. You see, confidence is not a characteristic of the intelligent. The thing about being intelligent is you know how little you know. But it's a characteristic of the incompetent that they lack self-awareness. So let's continue, all of us, to value learning and reading and writing and thinking. And through those skills, we can all develop failure literacy. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.